Imagine standing in the grand halls of the Alhambra, the most beautiful palace in all of Europe, looking out over the city of Granada. The year is 1492. You're the last Muslim ruler of Spain, and you know that in a few hours you'll hand over the keys to this magnificent city, ending 8 centuries of Islamic civilization on the Iberian Peninsula. As you take one final look at the kingdom your ancestors built, tears stream down your face. Your mother, standing beside you, says something that will echo through history. Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man. This is the story of how one of the greatest civilizations in medieval history came crashing down, and trust me, it's way more complex and fascinating than you might think. Before we dive into the fall, we need to understand just how incredible Al-Andalus actually was. We're talking about a civilization that was so advanced, so sophisticated, that while most of Europe was struggling through the Dark Ages, Muslim Spain was experiencing a golden age that rivaled anything the world had ever seen. Picture this. In the 10th century, Cordoba, the capital of Al-Andalus, was the most advanced city in all of Europe. We're talking about a city with street lighting, running water, public libraries, universities, and a population of 500,000 people at a time when London and Paris were basically small towns with maybe 20 or 30,000 inhabitants living in pretty rough conditions. The Great Mosque of Cordoba was so magnificent that even after the Christian conquest, they couldn't bring themselves to destroy it completely. Instead, they built a cathedral right in the middle of it, and you can still visit it today. The Library of Cordoba alone held over 400,000 books at a time when the largest library in Christian Europe might have had a few hundred manuscripts. Think about that for a second. Muslims in Spain were preserving and translating the works of ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, works that had been lost to Western Europe. They were advancing mathematics, introducing concepts like algebra, which, by the way, comes from the Arabic word al-jabr. They were making groundbreaking discoveries in medicine, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, and poetry. Al-Andalus wasn't just a Muslim society either. This is really important to understand. It was one of the most diverse and tolerant places in medieval Europe. Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived side by side, and while it wasn't perfect, and there were definitely hierarchies and tensions, there was a level of coexistence that was remarkable for the time. Jewish scholars wrote some of their most important works in Arabic. Christians adopted Arabic customs and language. This mixing of cultures created something unique, a hybrid civilization that took the best from Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions. So how did this incredible civilization fall? Well, that's where our story gets really interesting, because the fall of Al-Andalus wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, painful decline that took centuries, and it's filled with dramatic battles, political intrigue, betrayal, and some really tragic miscalculations. Let's rewind to the beginning. Muslims first arrived in Spain in 711, when a Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with about 7,000 troops. The Visigothic kingdom that ruled Spain at the time was weak, divided, and corrupt. In an incredibly short amount of time, just 7 years, Muslims had conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula. They called it Al-Andalus, and for the next few centuries it would be one of the jewels of the Islamic world. But here's the thing about empires. They rise, they peak, and then they start to crack. For Al-Andalus, the cracks started appearing much earlier than you might think. The first major blow came in 1031, when the Caliphate of Cordoba, which had held Al-Andalus together as a unified political entity, completely collapsed. And I mean completely. It shattered into about 30 small kingdoms called Taifas, which is an Arabic word that basically means factions or parties. Imagine if Spain suddenly broke up into 30 different countries, each with its own ruler, its own army, its own policies. That's essentially what happened. Now, you might think this would be a disaster, and politically it was, but culturally, the Taifa period was actually a golden age. These small kingdoms competed with each other not just militarily but culturally. Each ruler wanted the best poets, the finest architects, the most impressive palaces. They were trying to outdo each other, and this competition led to an explosion of artistic and intellectual achievement. But military, that's a different story. These little kingdoms were weak, divided, and constantly fighting amongst themselves, and guess who was watching all this happen with great interest? The Christian kingdoms in the north. The Christian reconquest of Spain, known as the Reconquista, had actually been going on since the beginning. As soon as Muslims conquered Spain in 711, small Christian kingdoms in the mountainous north started pushing back. But for centuries it was a slow, grinding process with small gains here and there. However, once Al-Andalus fractured into these weak Taifa kingdoms, the Reconquista picked up serious momentum. Christian kings started conquering Muslim territory at an alarming rate, and here's where it gets really interesting from a political standpoint. The Muslim Taifa kings, instead of uniting against the common threat, actually started paying tribute to Christian kingdoms. They called it parios, basically protection money. Think about how wild this is. Muslim rulers were literally paying Christian kings not to attack them, and this money helped fund the Christian kingdoms, making them even stronger. It's like paying your enemy to build a bigger army. Some Taifa kings even allied with Christian rulers against other Muslim kingdoms. The level of disunity was just staggering. In 1085, something happened that sent shockwaves through the entire Islamic world. Toledo fell to the Christians. Now, why was Toledo so important? It wasn't just any city. Toledo had been one of the great capitals of Al-Andalus, a center of learning and culture. Its fall was symbolic. It showed that the Reconquista wasn't just taking border territories anymore. It was conquering the heartland of Al-Andalus. Muslim rulers in Spain panicked, and they made a decision that would have huge consequences. They called for help from North Africa. Enter the Almoravids, a Berber dynasty from Morocco that had built a powerful empire stretching from Senegal to Algeria. These guys were warriors, strict in their religious practice, disciplined, and they had a formidable military. The Taifa kings sent messengers begging them to cross over and help defend Al-Andalus against the Christian advance. But here's the catch. One of the Muslim scholars at the time warned the Taifa kings with a famous statement. He basically said, "It's better to be a camel herder in Morocco than a swineherd in Castile," meaning it's better to be ruled by strict Muslim Berbers than by Christians. But he knew what was coming. The Almoravids came, and they did stop the Christian advance. In 1086 they defeated Alfonso VI of Castile at the Battle of Sagrajas in a major victory that temporarily halted the Reconquista. But then the Almoravids looked around at these Taifa kings living in luxury, drinking wine, enjoying poetry and music, and they were appalled. From their strict, austere perspective, these rulers had become soft and un-Islamic. So the Almoravids decided they weren't just going to help Al-Andalus, they were going to take it over. By 1094, they had conquered most of the Taifa kingdoms and incorporated them into their North African empire. For a while this actually worked. Al-Andalus was unified again under strong military leadership, and the Christian advance slowed. But the Almoravids faced the same problem every foreign dynasty faces when they try to rule a sophisticated, culturally different society. They were outsiders. The people of Al-Andalus, who were used to a more refined cosmopolitan culture, resented these austere Berber warriors. Over time, the Almoravids themselves became softer, more influenced by Andalusian culture, and their military edge dulled. By the 1140s, the Almoravid Empire was collapsing, both in North Africa and in Spain, and guess what happened? Al-Andalus fractured again into small Taifa kingdoms, which historians call the Second Taifa period. And just like before, these kingdoms were weak and divided, and the Christians started conquering territory again at a rapid pace. Seeing this pattern yet? It's like watching the same tragedy play out twice. So the Muslim rulers did the same thing again. They called for ELP from North Africa. But this time it was a different dynasty, the Almohads, another Berber movement that was even stricter and more puritanical than the Almoravids. The Almohads came, they defeated the Christians in several battles, they took over Al-Andalus, and for a brief moment, it looked like Muslim Spain might be saved again. But then came 1212. And this is where everything changes. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, in 1212, was the beginning of the end for Muslim Spain. This was a massive confrontation between the Almohad army and a coalition of Christian kingdoms. Pope Innocent III had actually called for a crusade, and knights from all over Europe came to fight. The Christian forces, led by the kings of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, won a crushing, decisive victory. The Almohad army was destroyed, tens of thousands of Muslim soldiers were killed, the Almohad Caliph barely escaped with his life. This defeat shattered Almohad power, and within a few decades their empire collapsed completely. The consequences for Al-Andalus were catastrophic. Within 30 years of Las Navas de Tolosa, the Christians had conquered almost all of Muslim Spain. Cordoba fell in 1236, Valencia fell in 1238, Seville, one of the greatest cities of Al-Andalus, fell in 1248. These weren't just military defeats. Each city that fell represented centuries of Islamic civilization being wiped away. Libraries were destroyed or scattered, mosques were converted into churches, Muslim populations were re-expelled, enslaved, or forced to convert. By 1250, only one Muslim kingdom remained in Spain, the Emirate of Granada, a small mountainous region in the south. And here's the incredible part. This tiny kingdom survived for another 250 years, becoming the last bastion of Islamic civilization in Western Europe. How did Granada survive so long when everything else had fallen? Well, it's a combination of geography, diplomacy, and frankly a lot of luck. Granada's location was its greatest asset. It's tucked away in the Sierra Nevada mountains, which made it really difficult to conquer. The terrain was rugged, easy to defend, and the Christian kingdoms would need a massive, expensive military campaign to take it. But geography alone doesn't explain Granada's survival. The rulers of Granada were incredibly shrewd diplomatically. They became vassals to Castile, meaning they acknowledged Christian overlordship and paid tribute. They played the Christian kingdoms against each other, forming alliances when needed, switching sides when necessary. It was a delicate balancing act, and for a long time it worked. Granada also became a refuge. Muslims fleeing from conquered territories flooded into the emirate, bringing with them their skills, knowledge, and wealth. The city of Granada became incredibly prosperous and culturally vibrant. The Nasrid dynasty, which ruled Granada, poured resources into art and architecture, creating some of the most stunning buildings in Islamic history. The Alhambra Palace complex, which they built during this period, is widely considered the pinnacle of Islamic architecture in the West. Even today, millions of tourists visit Granada just to see the Alhambra, and when you walk through those halls with their intricate geometric patterns, the delicate stucco work, the serene courtyards with their reflecting pools, you understand why people say it's one of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed. But beneath this cultural flourishing, Granada was living on borrowed time. The emirate survived partly because the Christian kingdoms were busy fighting each other or dealing with their own internal problems. Castile went through periods of civil war and weak leadership. Aragon was expanding into the Mediterranean, focusing on Italy and other territories. As long as the Christians were divided, Granada could survive. Everything changed in 1469 with a marriage. Ferdinand of Aragon married Isabella of Castile, uniting the two most powerful Christian kingdoms in Spain. This is the famous Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, and they had a clear goal: complete the Reconquista by conquering Granada. But they were patient. They spent years building up their military, improving their artillery, and securing their position. They knew that conquering Granada wouldn't be easy. In 1482, the war for Granada began, and it would last 10 brutal years. the Christians used a strategy of slowly strangling the emirate, conquering the surrounding towns and fortresses one by one, cutting off Granada's supplies and reinforcements. They had superior artillery, better funding, and most importantly, they were united while Granada was falling apart from within. And this is the tragic part. Even in its final years, even when facing total annihilation, Granada was torn by internal conflict. There was a civil war between the Sultan Abu al-Hasan Ali and his son Muhammad XII, who's better known by his Spanish name Boabdil. Father and son were literally fighting each other for control, while the Christian armies were at the gates. It's heartbreaking to read about because you realize that if the Muslims of Granada had been united, if they had put aside their internal conflicts and focused on the external threat, they might have held out longer or negotiated better terms. By 1491, the city of Granada itself was under siege. The Christian armies surrounded it completely. No food was getting in, no reinforcements were coming. The people inside were starving. Boabdil, who was now the sole ruler after his father's death, knew it was over. He began secret negotiations with Ferdinand and Isabella to surrender the city. On January 2, 1492, Boabdil rode out of the Alhambra and handed over the keys to Granada to the Catholic monarchs. There's a place near Granada called the Moor's Sigh, a mountain pass where legend says Boabdil stopped to take one last look at the city he had lost, and that's when he wept Nd. His mother rebuked him with those famous words, "Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." Whether this actually happened or not, it captures the tragedy of that moment. The last Muslim ruler of Spain, losing the last piece of Al-Andalus, watching 8 centuries of Islamic civilization come to an end. The terms of surrender were actually relatively generous at first. Muslims were guaranteed the right to practice their religion, keep their properties and maintain their customs. But these promises didn't last long. Within 10 years, the Catholic monarchs went back on their word. Muslims were given a choice: convert to Christianity or leave. Those who converted, called Moriscos, were treated with suspicion and persecution. In 1609, over a century after Granada fell, King Philip III expelled all Moriscos from Spain, about 300,000 people. This was ethnic cleansing. Families that had lived in Spain for centuries, even those who had genuinely converted to Christianity, were forcibly expelled to North Africa. So what led to the fall of Al-Andalus? When you look at the big picture, several factors come together to create this tragedy. First and most importantly was political disunity. The fracturing of Al-Andalus into Taifa kingdoms was the original sin that made everything else possible. When Muslim rulers fought each other instead of their common enemies, when they paid tribute to Christian kings, when they invited foreign armies to intervene, they were sealing their own fate. Compare this to the Christian kingdoms, which, despite their own conflicts, managed to unite when it mattered most, especially with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. Second was military technology and tactics. By the late medieval period, the Christians had developed superior artillery and more effective military organizations. The bombards and cannons they used in the siege of Granada were devastating against medieval fortifications. The Muslims of Granada simply couldn't match this military innovation. Third was the lack of external support. Al-Andalus was isolated. It was the far western edge of the Islamic world, separated from the main centers of Muslim power by the Mediterranean Sea. When Granada needed help, when they sent desperate messages to Muslim rulers in North Africa, in Egypt, in the Ottoman Empire, no substantial help came. Everyone was dealing with their own problems. The Ottomans were busy conquering Constantinople and expanding into Eastern Europe. The Mamluks in Egypt were focused on their own threats. North African dynasties were in decline. Granada was alone. Fourth was demographic change. As the Reconquista progressed, Christians repopulated conquered territories while Muslims were expelled or fled to Granada. Over time, the balance of power shifted dramatically in favor of the Christians, simply in terms of population, resources, and territory. But there's also something deeper here, something about the nature of civilizations and how they decline. Al-Andalus at its peak was confident, innovative, and culturally vibrant. It was a place where different ideas could meet and mix, where intellectual curiosity was valued. But by the time of Granada's fall, that confidence was gone. The repeated defeats, the internal conflicts, the sense of being under siege both literally and culturally, it all wore away at the foundations of society. The Granada of 1492 was a shadow of the Cordoba of 929. The fall of Al-Andalus had consequences that rippled far beyond Spain. Thousands of Muslims, Jews, and even some Christians fled to North Africa, taking with them their knowledge, skills, and cultural traditions. These refugees influenced the societies they settled in, particularly in Morocco and Algeria. In Spain itself, the expulsion of Muslims and Jews, who had been vital to the economy and culture, left a gap that took generations to fill. Some historians argue that Spain's relative decline in the following centuries was partly due to expelling so much of its talented population. For the Islamic world, the loss of Al-Andalus was traumatic. It represented the first major, permanent loss of territory to Christian powers, reversing the expansion that had characterized the early centuries of Islam. While the Ottomans were still expanding in the east, in the west, the borders of the Islamic world were contracting. The memory of Al-Andalus became a kind of lost paradise in Islamic consciousness, a golden age that could never be recovered. There are lessons here that resonate even today. The importance of unity in the face of external threats. The danger of short-term thinking, like the Taifa kings who paid tribute to Christian kingdoms without considering the long-term consequences. The way internal divisions can be exploited by external enemies. The tragedy of leaders fighting each other while their civilization crumbles around them. But there's also a more hopeful legacy. The cultural and intellectual achievements of Al-Andalus didn't disappear entirely. The translation movement that preserved Greek philosophy, the advances in mathematics and science, the architectural techniques, the agricultural innovations, all of these things influenced European civilization profoundly. When you study the Renaissance, you're studying, in part, the fruits of knowledge that passed through Al-Andalus. When you use words like algebra, algorithm, alcohol, or even just the number 0, you're using the legacy of Al-Andalus. Today, you can still walk through the streets of Cordoba, Granada, Seville, and Toledo and see the physical remains of this lost civilization. The Mezquita in Cordoba, with its forest of columns, the Alhambra in Granada, with its sublime beauty, the Giralda Tower in Seville. These buildings stand as monuments to what was achieved, but also to what was lost. They remind us that civilizations, no matter how advanced or powerful, are fragile things. They require constant effort to maintain, wisdom to govern, and unity to defend. The story of Al-Andalus is ultimately a human story. It's about ambition and achievement, about the heights human civilization can reach when different cultures work together. But it's also about hubris and division, about how internal conflicts can destroy even the mightiest empires. It's about the tragedy of Boabdil, handing over the keys to the last Muslim city in Spain, knowing that he was the one who lost what his ancestors had built over 8 centuries. And it's about the hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, Muslims, Jews, and even Christians, who valued the convivencia, the coexistence that Al-Andalus represented, who lost their homes, their way of life, and their place in a world that was rapidly changing. If there's one thing to take away from this story, it's this: greatness is never guaranteed, and it can slip away faster than you think if you're not careful. The Muslims of Al-Andalus built something extraordinary, one of the greatest civilizations in medieval history. But they lost through division, short-sightedness, and the failure to recognize existential threats until it was too late. That's a lesson that transcends any particular time, place, or civilization. It's a lesson about the fragility of human achievement and the eternal importance of unity, wisdom, and foresight in preserving what we build. So the next time you hear about the Alhambra, or see those beautiful geometric patterns of Islamic art, remember that behind that beauty is a story of rise and fall, of glory and tragedy, of a civilization that shone brilliantly for 8 centuries before fading into memory. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn something from their story that helps us avoid making the same mistakes in our own time.